Costa is brought to you by FQM Trident Limited, a subsidiary of First Quantum Minerals Limited. The government has proposed a 2025 national budget of around 217.1 billion kwacha. Now, this represents about 26% of Zambia's gross domestic product, GDP. This marks an increase of around 39 billion kwacha as compared to the budget of 177.8 billion allocated in the year 2024, before obviously the supplementary budget. Now, Finance and National Planning Minister Dr. Stumbeko Musokotwane on Friday attributed this rise to the debt restructuring process, which he said had unlocked additional resources. According to the minister, domestic revenues will now fund approximately 174 billion kwacha, while 8.2 billion is expected to come from grants provided by cooperating partners. The remainder of 34.7 billion kwacha will be sourced through borrowing. This budget has been unveiled against a backdrop of severe drought and power shortages, with many Zambians looking towards the government for reassurance and support. The big question: does this 217 billion kwacha budget address the challenges of mainly the Zambian domestic household, including private sector and the SMEs? We talk more of this right after this. Good evening and welcome to it. My name is Costa Mwansa. This is Costa. You can watch us live on our Facebook page. It's Costa Mwansa on the live stream, as well as Diamond TV Zambia. You can also catch us live on our YouTube page. It's Diamond TV Zambia. It's 271 on DSTV and channel 20 on GOTV. My guest this evening is country senior partner at PwC Zambia, Andrew Chwe. He's discussing the budget for 2025, building resilience for inclusive growth and improved livelihoods. Andrew Chwe, it's always a pleasure to host you, and welcome to Costa.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
48 hours after the minister presented the budget onto the floor of Parliament on Friday, and your brief summary of this budget can best be described as ambitious but constrained. Why do you say that?
So, ambitious but constrained because from the ambition side, if you look at the growth in the budget, if you look from a total absolute expenditure point of view, the original budget for 2024, which is this year, was about 177 billion kwacha. It was increased, I think, came to about 198.6 billion kwacha with a supplementary budget. Growing to 217 billion in 2025 is a significant increase. If you look at how it's meant to be funded, I mean, it's a 9% increase, but it's coming off a very big number. If you look at how it's meant to be funded from the income side, some of the income lines, your domestic revenues expected to grow over 20%, taxes over 20%. The answer is, the question is, in an economy that is constrained, perhaps won't grow to that degree. How will that be achieved? So on the face of it, you don't see too many changes, but then when you break down the numbers, you see some areas where there are some significant expansions, so that's ambitious. If you think about some of the targets that are there, to grow GDP 6.6%, the current year is expected to be 2.3%, inflation targeting 6 to 8%. I mean, it's obviously the long-term target, but we're currently at 15.6%. You look at borrowing to keep that at 1.9% of GDP, to keep the fiscal deficit at 3.1% of GDP. Some of those, in the context of where we are at the moment, they do seem fairly ambitious and bullish, even though, like I said, on the face of it, you may not see too many changes. When I say constrained, I basically mean there's the reality of the crisis that we have at the moment, and there's plenty that people would have hoped to see. What sort of support is going to individuals, to businesses directly, whether it's tax reductions, tax relief, etc., which can often come during challenge times. A lot of that is not there. So if I've spoken to the Minister of Finance, he's been very clear. Those are things he would have wanted to do, but hands are tied, so he can't do them. So that's obviously constrained. And I guess if you then put it all into one big bucket, is that the ambition in terms of how to grow revenues, how to grow the budget, is in the context of the environment that we are in. So that ambition may be dampened by the constraints of how the economy actually performs. So that's why I described it as ambitious
but constrained.
I'll
borrow your word of constrained, because in this theme, we talk resilience, inclusivity, and improvement of livelihoods. When I look at the president's speech just a week before the budget presentation, his tone has been for Zambians to be hopeful, for Zambians to hold on. In short, this economy is stressed. People have been squeezed out. Inflation has gone high, meaning very little disposable income. The cost of living, by and large, is high, fueled by obviously high petrol prices, high transport costs, and the basic pricing of commodities. So when you're telling people that you're building resilience and there's inclusivity in terms of growth, how do we expect to increase revenue to about 21.3% of GDP in an already squeezed economy?
So I think the way to look at the budget, and when one thing that I think I must commend the Honourable Minister and the team and the government is the consistency, right? To understand this budget and any of the preceding ones, you actually have to read them together, right? Because there's a lot which are policy measures that were introduced in the very first budget that have basically carried through into the current. So you haven't seen, despite the pressure that may be on the government, reversals in some of the incentives or decisions that they have been made previously. Corporate taxes were lowered from 35 to 30% in 2022. Each of the last 4 years, including the 2021, so all the way from 2021 up to 2024, there have been concessions given to individuals in terms of PAYE. If you look at some of the incentives that were given to try and stimulate manufacturing, especially for export purposes, up to 15 years tax holidays, they're still there, right? So some of that speaks to consistency, which if we achieve should then help with resilience of the economy. But at the heart, right now we're dealing with an energy crisis, right? And that energy crisis is what is permeating into all aspects of not just the economy, but society, livelihoods, etc., you name it. And when you read the budget on its own, you don't see all of the measures that have been taken. But I think if you look at some of the actions that have been taken during the year, whether it's trying to make it easier to move to renewables, make it cheaper to bring in renewables, easier to generate power if you are below a certain level of capacity and things like that, there are all those actions that have been taken. So I think the other thing that's important from an inclusivity point of view is the clear signal in this budget that for now, the immediate priorities are those who are least privileged, right? Or those who are deemed to be in that category, because you can see how much has been allocated to spending for them.
The facts obviously speak to themselves. We'll come to look at issues around social protection, 67% there.
Growth, yeah.
Credit guarantee, 121%.
Growth, yeah.
But let's speak to whether this budget is pro-private sector, it's pro-SME, it's pro-micro businesses, it's pro-domestic household. When I'm a barber shop, I'm a salon, I'm a bakery, I'm whatever small business that has been hampered terribly income-wise by 21 hours of load shedding in a day, 3 days in many instances. My income has reduced, but the taxman still gives me penalties for paying my returns late. NAPSA still slaps me. Well, I know there was a new act now that is being amended on the aspect of those penalties. But we've now even introduced the aspect of smart invoicing and trying to be smart in the way we are not leaving any coin uncollected. So just to amplify your point, if we're not seeing any stimulus from tax moratoriums or pay-as-you-earn being tweaked, would I be right to say that this is a non-pro-private sector, this is a non-SME budget? It doesn't speak to small business.
I think context is everything, Costa. Context is everything. I think it's a bit of a balancing act. In fact, it's a significant balancing act, one that will never actually be achieved. Even in the best of times, resources are always constrained, right? Even if you've got an infinite amount of money, as you might imagine it, when you have that sort of money, you will have challenges with making sure you get everything that you need. So the budget, there's obviously a resource constraint. What is clear is that the priority in terms of how this budget has been structured is underprivileged and those who are least able to fend for themselves. That was in the supplementary budget. It's in this budget. If you look at that, that's the decision that has been made. For the rest, in terms of whether it's business or individuals, the question is what can actually be, what can you afford to give them? What can you afford to give? There are some indirect benefits that are expected. So, for example, if you stimulate social spending through things like social cash transfers, etc., you hope that some of that money will circle back into private hands. The issue is that it's not a direct process. If you think about growing things like CDF and putting money into communities, right, that is meant to be a direct stimulus into those communities. But by and large, and that's why I said in my earlier statement, constrained, me and you who are working to earn a salary, we're not getting anything. If you look at this year on its own, this year we probably would have wanted to get something. We haven't. If you look at all the years put together, we have been getting something. So I think the hands are tied, resources are constrained. This speaks to the prioritization, but I think it also speaks to, because we've had a series of, the budget has been recalibrated over a number of years in terms of where the priorities going to be, in terms of priority sectors, where should the investment be going, etc., etc. You can see even things like construction are increasing. So I think if you look at it over a period of time, there's probably stuff there for everybody. But if you look at this year in isolation, you could come to that conclusion that it's probably more social than private sector.
You talk about this being an aspect of a balancing act. So you're saying this budget has probably tried to focus more on saving lives, or let me call it, has focused more on an emergency response.
Correct.
Over 6.5 million people are going hungry because of the drought. So let's put some more money into, food security, distributing food relief. Let's push more money towards social cash transfer, cash for work, and so on. From an economic perspective, the other argument would be, I always argue this. It's like always on an aeroplane. They tell you when the oxygen masks come down, put the mask on yourself first before you put others on. What am I trying to say? Yeah. If we don't save the small businesses, probably there will be no tomorrow for jobs. There will be no tomorrow to support livelihoods if we're only eating for today. Yeah. Is there not much that this budget could have done? Because if there's no incentive, there's no stimulus. In fact, my question to you, Andrew, would be this: that this energy crisis has damaged industry, it has damaged the business sector. Have we as a country done an audit, and has this budget responded to that?
I think obviously it's a situation that's still ongoing. You give a very valid comment, you give a very valid observation in terms of if we don't save the businesses, what happens? Because you could argue consumption, once it's gone, that's it. Like I said, the intent seems to be indirect stimulus, which is it may or may not have as dramatic an effect. But like I said, if you look at it over a period of time, there's probably some things that have been put there for business to encourage them along the way. certainly. I think the other thing to think about in terms of that particular question is that you've got things like trying to make it more affordable from a credit perspective. You can see things like credit guarantee scheme moving from just over 300 million to 850 million. It's still a small number, but the intent is there to try and bring down the cost of doing business. I think the other thing that is key is that what else can be done under the circumstances, right? And when hands are tied, is it realistic, for example, to lower taxes? It's probably not at this particular point in time. So it's a difficult state of affairs. I think if you read into some of the other sentiment that's in the budget, some of the projections that are there, the expectation is that it will be for a short period. I have I raise my eyebrows a bit around how aggressive growth is expected to rebound in 2025 going forward, because recovery does take time, and I think we haven't even reached the bottom yet. But if you have a normal, even if you have a normal year from a rainfall perspective and energy generation starts to come back, it probably won't come back at the same level. If you have an agribusiness that has lost significantly this year, even if rain is normal next year, if all the capital disappeared because the harvest was poor, they're probably not going to return at the same rate. So I think it's a difficult situation. I agree with you. It's something that we'd have wanted to see. And it goes back to my earlier statement around the constraint. But the question is, a business, if it fails, perhaps can recover. If your people die of hunger, that's it. They're gone.
Difficult situation indeed. And obviously in crafting not only this budget for 2025, obviously 2024, 23 and 22, the tough issues had to be considered. One, on the aspect that we were coming out of 2020 sovereign debt default.
Yeah.
And so that was a big thorny issue. 2-3 years down the line, you're hit with the worst drought ever experienced in over 100 years. So all these are consideration of factors. We go into emergency response, but we also need to consider that we are sort of cash strapped. We have debt lingering over our heads. Let's begin with the debt. We restructured $3.9 billion of debt,
bondholders,
in terms of the bondholders. Secured additional help through a $388 million dollars loan from the IMF and a potential $140 million credit line from the World Bank. This new Dawn administration has really toasted to this, that it gives us more leverage to spread a bit longer and reduce the annual repayment.
Yep.
But again, we are coming from a scenario where for almost 2 years we were not servicing this debt both on principal and interest. Let's just tackle the debt scenario. Have we been given some headroom?
Absolutely, because it didn't matter that Zambia was not paying. We still had to budget for it. If I owe you money, I cannot plan not to pay you, right? Because it's not something that a responsible government or individual does. So if you look at how that has evolved, right, since, say, June 2023, when we started having significant traction with the restructuring, first the $6.3 billion for the other official creditors, which has been stretched over an extended period, I think up to 12 years. Then in 2024, we had the bondholders, $3.89 billion. We had about $840 million written off. The rest restructured all the way up to 2053 and 2035 in different instances, obviously breaking that down. The one that's currently ongoing, and I think it's something that wasn't too much, it wasn't highlighted as much as it should in the speech, the Honorable Minister indicating that of the $3 billion that was left, another 1.5 has successfully been restructured. That's to do with some of the Chinese banks. So when you put that all together, what has happened? You basically have more certainty around that number, which is being put in the budget, around what is being serviced. Around 16 billion kwacha equivalent is being set aside for 2025. If you compare that to what was there previously, it's a significant reduction, right? So your budget in terms of absolute value has grown. the amount that has been set aside for debt service, especially on the external side, has reduced. So you now have the opportunity to use those resources elsewhere. Okay, so it's really the budget. However, so here's the point though, that in the year when you would have wanted to now start recalibrating your budget to reflect the certainty and the reduced amount there, you now have to deal with an emergency response. So some of the immediate benefit that you might have expected to see from certainty around debt restructuring is not going to be
My question was going to be that,
but actually, because you can actually redeploy those resources into the crisis response, is a positive. Because remember, if you had the debt restructuring, debt repayment at the previous levels, we might not even be able to do what we're doing right now in terms of
just to paint a clearer and a more simpler, picture. I think the largest concern when it came to budgets before debt restructuring was that when you look at the ratio of our debt then in relation to GDP, if the budget, for instance, was 100 billion kwacha, almost 90 billion of that amount would have gone to debt towards debt servicing, and you're only remaining with a chunk of about 10 billion towards social spending or social sector spending and emoluments. So there was no room really for growth. And then the way these contracts were designed was always that, again, we were due for certain bullet payments, I think, starting the same coming fiscal year of about...
Well, it was actually 2022, 2024, 2026.
Exactly. So have we navigated ourselves out of those woods?
Primarily, yeah, to a very, very large extent. So we're not where we need to be. In fact, where we were, we are in a much, much better place. And I guarantee you, if Zambia had to be dealing with the climate crisis and energy plus debt, like being in gridlock, the economy would pretty much be on its knees, because some of what's coming through in terms of support from multilaterals, etc., would not have come through. So this is where you see. Now, the upside we haven't fully realized, because the benefits that we were expected are now being channeled elsewhere. So it's quite fundamental and something that's actually noteworthy. We have one less significant thing to think about at this time when our energies are focused on energy, if I can put it that way.
Based on official information from the Ministry of Finance, the last I interviewed the minister, he told me that we're now sitting at around 14, or let me just say confidently, over $14 billion of debt.
In fact, the budget is just over 15.
When I look at the function by expenditure, you did already touch on this. We are projecting that we will spend around 16.6 billion kwacha towards external debt on interest and principal. That's in terms of dismantling external debt. We are projecting to spend around 5.6 billion on dismantling of arrears. These are domestic. But when you look at what is being owed in terms of local suppliers and local debt, one could argue that this is just like a drop in the ocean.
Absolutely.
And where I'm going is, it's like the government is not interested in stimulating the local economy, because when I pay somebody who's been owed for years, they go back to lenders, be it banks, they still pay the taxes, they still circulate this money. And now we've gone into this rigorous or thorough checking of especially the local debt. There's this audits and so on. Why do we seemingly concentrate more on servicing only the foreign debt and not breaking down the local one, which will trickle into ripple effects?
And it goes back to earlier statement, constrained. I think the Honourable Minister, I've heard the ST several times, Mr. Nkulukusa, categorically state it gives him sleepless nights, the amount of money government owes. Now, let's contextualize it, right? The domestic arrears in the budget that's reported is give or take around 80 billion, right? So let's even assume you're paying it at 8 billion per annum. That's 10 years before you clear it. That's not great, right? And when you think about it, if you could inject even half of that into the economy, that's a huge, huge impact, right? It's a massive, massive amount. So I think it's there. I think there's a debt dismantling strategy that has been put out, and we should probably. I mean, I appeared before one of the parliamentary committees last year, and I was saying this is an area that needs a lot more focus. We focus a lot on the external debt and the domestic debt, so the government bonds, the treasury bills, that structured bit, but the amount owing to suppliers does need a lot more attention. But like I've said, in this, if we talk to the Honourable Minister, I can bet he would have wanted to pay a lot more of that down, but right now constrained.
And obviously it becomes a sad scenario because from a bulk term, we're just dismantling arrears. These can further be broken down into different aspects, like you're saying, suppliers, contractors. But there are people who will die and wait for years without getting their money.
I'm sure there are many. It's a difficult situation. But let's go back, right? And the same thing we're talking about. Under the circumstances, you've got people who are hungry, so the priority is perhaps clear off some of the areas. Hopefully, it's something that can receive a lot more attention once the situation normalizes, because that's direct stimulus into the economy.
So we've gotten this debt restructured, gives us a bit of headroom, gives us a bit of leverage to sort of reduce this debt ratio to GDP and begin to spend a bit more. And then we are hit, obviously, with this drought, goes into a crisis. So now we are putting more money, 7.4%, around 16.1 billion, into social protection as part of an emergency response. Now, from an economic point of view, the thinking would be that, okay, yes, we borrowed and we're being given a bit more money by the IMF. Shouldn't we be plowing this money into areas that will give us some sort of return on investment or help us build capacity to be able to pay back? Does this budget speak to areas of development in the immediate and short term for us as an economy to survive?
That is the critical question, because remember, there's no point restructuring debt, then when it's time to pay, you can't pay, right? In fact, nobody will even entertain you to say, when it's time to pay, you say, can we have a conversation? So like I said, the way that I see it, you have to look at the budgets in sort of in aggregate. And then if you then say, okay, so where is the growth supposed to come from to build, the resilience that we've spoken about? Because once you build that resilience, you should have greater capacity to pay off your debt. The mining sector and what's happening there. If you look at the mining sector in this budget, things like mineral royalty, there's a 73% increase in the projected mineral royalty in the year, 17 billion up from 10 billion the previous year, which I think is a sign that the expected benefits that have been there now about increased production and increased activity in the sector will start to now materialize. If you think about sectors such as agriculture and what's happening there, yes, agriculture has had a bad time, but you can still see the government continue to invest into the sector of things like the large-scale farming blocks, which are supposed to anchor agriculture going forward and actually deal with the issue of resilience, because they are meant to be irrigated. Hopefully we have power at the time. There's the power question. In the budget, I mean, it was very subtle, the Honourable Minister bringing up the issue of tariffs, whether we can get to cost reflectivity, because the question is, would you rather have expensive power or no power? But at the same time, some of the reforms that have happened in the energy sector, such as open access, meaning if you are an independent power producer and you're producing and you find your own customer, it means you're no longer looking at ZESCO as your counterparty, because most will say, ZESCO, we don't want to pay ZESCO's tariff, perhaps ZESCO is bloated, and there's obviously a lot of discussion there. But then whatever tariff you agree with your counterparty is what you get. So that then should also encourage more investment in the sector, but it needs a cost-reflective tariff. So underneath all of this, you have activities that are already in motion, right? If you look at 15-year tax incentives to stimulate investment in multi-facility economic zones for the purpose of export process to grow the manufacturing sector, as well as beneficiate some of what is produced in the country, all of those things are still on the table. And the fact that they haven't been reversed in this budget, which could have been an option in order to try and get short-term gains, tells you there's still a view on the long term in order order to grow the economy. It's just that in this particular budget, I think some of the areas, I mean, notable as well here, if you see the expenditures going into things like construction, a sector that for a while has been subdued, you see an uptick, 8 billion to 11 billion. So that sector can look forward to more activity this year. But notwithstanding, there's obviously a clear signal. Social support is huge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing for certain sectors.
I think the argument, Andrew, is on the aspect that we're depending. A budget has two sides to it.
Yep.
There's obviously expenditure, which in many aspects is the easiest, because it's very easy to point at what you want to do, expend.
Yeah.
But the income side is the most difficult. Over 80%
domestic
of this budget is projected to be raised through domestic revenue, and grants. Nobody's giving grants as much. I mean, if you go 10, 20 years back, this budget looked different because, again, over 60% was coming from international aid and grants. Now, why do I refer to this? If over 80% of income is expected to come from tax, it's like the famous saying that we are taxing the already overtaxed, squeezing milk from a stone. I mean, this economy is stressed. I mean, don't we see ourselves another 8 months down the line in 2025 going back to ask for a supplementary budget? How realistic or feasible is it to raise over 182 billion of this budget through the domestic
80%.
market?
So, I agree. It does seem quite ambitious in terms of those levels, but it's also a good thing, because when you're planning to spend only what you generate yourselves, it means you're also planning to borrow less. Okay? And one of the positives in the last few years, if you look at the track record of the Zambia Revenue Authority, when they say this is our target versus actual, we have challenged before, said this target looks very ambitious, and they've been able to meet it. All right? We can argue a bit about the methods that are applied, because some businesses will say, look, we've been under the cosh in the process. But what is happening, if you look at how that domestic revenue is coming up, company income tax is actually expected to go down, right, to about 22 billion kwacha, because companies are expected to be less profitable, just because of the cost environment. You were telling me before we came on air about how much you're spending on diesel every year. It means every month. It means your profitability will go down, even if you sustain the same level of operations. VAT is expected to increase significantly. This is where things like your smart invoicing come along the way. Now, what that is meant to do is, because the actual tax rates are not changing at all, right, at least for the major tax types. So what's meant to happen is people who are not currently being captured should be captured and brought into.
In fact, not to capture, but just
to. But the question is whether those who will be brought into the umbrella will be significant enough to actually drive that level.
But the increment actually from 2024 to 2025, Andrew, is quite huge, because if I'm not mistaken, my last engagement with Commissioner General of the ZRA this year, 2024, I think the target was around 125 billion.
Yeah, and it's going to 130.
Now we're talking almost 137 billion of this, rightfully because of things like smart invoice, like you're saying. VAT is targeted at almost 48.3 million, which is roughly around the largest, contributor. But my argument still is, you spoke about the methods.
Yeah.
With the power crisis, the high lending rates, small businesses, hustles, have no room for growth, have no room to borrow. Then you are slapped with penalties. Your accounts are being garnished.
I totally agree.
Is that really fair? That there's no moratorium, there's no exemption, there's really nothing to write home about?
The way that I see it, Costa, is that if you are law-abiding and doing your bit, tax and tax compliance should not inconvenience you, right? If you're just doing the right thing, right? We already know, every year we talk about what? The tax base needs to increase. When we have the FIC report, it tells us about how much tax evasion is going on. When we have statistics put out by the Zambia Revenue Authority themselves, they tell us about the extent of non-compliance. So I believe the focus is, you and me, who's doing the right thing, please leave us in peace. You know where the problems are. Can we close those gaps? What's the ZRA saying? Is that and there are other measures. So you've got, for example, smart invoicing, and the ZRA said there's huge tax fraud from a VAT perspective. If you are committing fraud, you should be under pressure, right? But that's not what you and me are doing. So close gaps like that. Use data and analytics to pinpoint where problems are. You've seen there's one that's coming where there will be advance income tax for remittances above $2,000. So if you're doing the right thing, you should have nothing to worry about. However, if you are non-compliant, then it will force you to become compliant. And it's from there that additional taxes are expected.
But if we further break it down, Andrew, to give a clear picture where I'm coming from, I was looking at the minister's speech, and when he talks about income and ZRA and the efforts, for example, only 20,000, under actually 20,000 taxpayers are registered on that system. Now, if we expect to raise over 137 billion from taxation, you look at this economy, 20 million people out of the last census, government takes up in the formal sector, maybe if we say roughly around over 1 million plus. The informal sector, which I'll just say private sector, is not by and large properly, captured. But this is where most of the jobs are coming from, plus, the agriculture sector. Can, for example, these 20,000 people,
20 million, or 20,000,
those that are on smart invoices, support this budget?
Obviously,
out of an economy,
there's still many more who need to come on board. Like I said, it's an ambitious target to grow your tax take by 20%, over 20%, when your economy is not going to grow at that rate. But like I said, two things to bear in mind. Number one is the expectation of how many more people can be brought into the tax net, those who are not already there. So that's not me and you who are already there. Number two is that if you go by the track record of the ZR in the last few years, year after year, we have said this target looks a bit ambitious, but lo and behold, they have managed to achieve
and
it,
exceeding it.
Achieve and exceed. So hopefully in the process,
aggressively.
Hopefully in the process, only those who are non-compliant should be inconvenienced. The person who is doing the right thing, and I think they've been. I mean, you've seen things like tax holidays, going into a time to pay agreement. All of those are trying to assist taxpayers to meet their obligations.
But the other flip side of the coin, Andrew,
as well.
Yes, ambitious target. Yes, they've exceeded and made it. And you keep on saying only those who are non-compliant should then worry. But it's also disheartening that in a country endowed with so much gold, sugilite, lithium, and all this, to hear an ex-ZRA commissioner, even government officials themselves saying we have failed to effectively or optimize taxation within the mining sector. And you can't run away from the fact that this has been our largest forex earner, when you look at traditional exports. Yes, whether there's been a cry on inconsistent policy and tax aspects and investment in the mines being pulled out, but why should we then squeeze more the small person and let the big mining giants go scot-free?
And that's so I'm not sure if they are, because Costa, if you look at the statistics, the mining sector, from my analysis, 2023 contributed 44% of the total revenues collected domestically. At some point, that number was 65% if you add mineral royalties, just within the last 5 years.
Isn't that good? That then we're getting money from our mines?
It depends on how you look at it, because the issue should be that over the years we should have diluted their contribution to the total tax take by growing other sectors, right? So we are overexposed to them. But let's look at this. The issue should be, we know that there are a number that are non-compliant. Costa, let's not get it twisted. Some of the most compliant taxpayers in the country are mining houses, right? They are the most scrutinized if you talk to them, right? The issue is that there are a number in that sector who are non-compliant. So and I personally have advocated for a better regulation, better regulator to go and oversee what's happening in the mining houses.
You've been tracking and monitoring this just, I think, a week or two so ago.
Yeah, sorry, Costa, before I lose my train of thought. And that is purely so that those who are non-compliant are dealt with, and those who are compliant are left alone. And so that we can get away from the narrative where we say the mining sector is non-compliant, because the real situation is like any other sector. There are some who are and some who aren't.
Yeah, but a rider to that, I was saying, you as PwC have and yourself as an individual have been tracking and being involved in this. A week or two ago, you hosted, was it a mining indab or something around that? Where have we failed to really get it right? I mean, we've flip-flopped from bringing scalable or graduating taxation on production. Others have argued that let's go, for example, what Botswana does with De Beers on the diamonds. It's 50-50 on production. It's 50-50 on marketing. There's been arguments around VAT refunds and all these things owed to the mines. Strangely, even war-torn countries like Congo surpass us now due to all this. With your experience and engagement, what really is the bottleneck or the sticky point? Well, on one hand, citizens are made to feel like our mines are being ripped off or we're going for a song. Yeah. The investors are saying the conditions are not favorable to invest.
Yeah. It's a combination of things, and our hypothesis is a lack of trust. That's where it comes from. That's the reason why, and we tabulated this between 2008 and 2022, there were 33 changes to the mining tax code, all right? 33. And we have a report where we've actually itemized them in case anyone wants to take a look. Now, how do you do mining? Because mining is about stability. So first, stability, you also need a competitive mining environment, but you actually have jurisdictions which are stable and competitive, which are able to attract investment because people know what they're getting themselves into. So a lack of stability over a number of years was one of the biggest problems and something that needs to be addressed. I think the mining companies themselves, on one hand, they don't really tell the full story of what they do, right? And there are some there who are non-compliant. Now, the issue is that we then paint the entire industry with a single brush. We develop a policy aimed at non-compliant and the non-compliant, which affect even those who are compliant. Let's not kid ourselves. There are very compliant mining houses and there are very non-compliant mining houses. And our hypothesis has been, if you have a better regulator, a better oversight of the sector, right, such that those who are doing the right thing, leave them. If you compare and contrast, think about the banking sector, right? Whose responsibility is it to regulate the banking sector?
Bank.
It's not the Ministry of Finance. It's a group of experts who can go and talk to a managing director of a bank and challenge them on how they're running their banks. Who does that for the mining sector? ZICTA, you've got it for the telcos. You've got the Energy Regulation Board for the energy companies. Who does it for the mining companies? It's the mines on one side and the politicians on the other. When the politicians feel a bit of pressure, they immediately move to adjust policy. What you need is a group of professionals who are able to say, no, this mine, we think there's something happening with their production. Remember, we have to make sure that everything that's due to the country for every ton, every kilogram of mineral that leaves the ground is due to the country, and it must be collected. And I think in that sort of landscape, there are certain factors on the part of government and other factors on the part of the mining companies. But I think with a long-term view, they can be resolved, and you can already see some of the benefits.
Based on the report that you did that captured those over 30 adjustments in the tax code from 2008 to over to 2022, obviously you saw trends, and you made comparison with what is internationally acceptable. I saw another report courtesy of, the Chamber of Mines, citing Chile, Australia, the Congo and Namibia and Botswana and others, where the chamber was saying, now we seem to have probably got it right in certain areas. Are you, from a PwC point of view, convinced that the current taxation system for the mines is yielding us what we're supposed to be getting?
I think it's on the way there. I say because it's more competitive. It's not the most competitive. That's in the world, but it's a lot more competitive. When we did things like adjust the deductibility of mineral royalty and those actual rates, I mean, there was obviously an uproar. Look at the look at the results in terms of investment going into the sector, look at what's projected in terms of the increase in mineral royalty that's expected for 2025. I think it will be a fairly substantial amount. I need to look at, it might even be record based on the analysis that I've done. That's starting to tell you something about the dividends flowing back into the country. The other thing that's there is that stability is not based on 4 years. Stability in the mining sector is decades, because the mining sector needs decades to plan. If you look, we've been talking about the likes of Mingomba as a project and that discovery, right? They'll need another 7-8 years before they start producing. They'll need another 15-20 years before they return the capital to their shareholders. I don't know what their actual life of mine will be. So the test is yet to come. The test from the appropriateness of the policy and regime is actually time. That will tell. So you much rather have a less favorable policy environment that doesn't change than one that changes rapidly.
So still on the income side, and again, for simplistic sake of the viewers tonight, like I said, a budget has got both income and expenditure. So it's like in a home, if we are spending for a family of 6 now, we're told in Lusaka 13,000 kwacha as our expenditure, and what this father or breadwinner, whoever is supporting the family in a home, is earning is say 10,000 kwacha. We've already got a deficit of around three there, and we only depend on this salary. Come to the country, we are endowed with all these resources that give us income. What I'm seeing from this budget is the fact that despite the fact that we've got minerals, by and large we expect to make more money from taxes than on the actual minerals. Earlier you spoke about diversification of the economy, moving away from being only largely mining dependent. And I mean, through my last 20 years of being in journalism, I've heard this song, Andrew, from the 5th now to the 8th National Development Plan. Diversification
of the economy.
But the numbers speak for themselves. Mineral royalty, we're projecting 17.3. Tourism levy is only sitting at around 74,000. So are we diversifying?
It's been a challenge. And remember, if you go back to read the budget in context, right? When I read the 2022 budget for the first time, it took me a long time to understand what was happening, because it was almost like a 90-degree pivot in terms of direction. And if you ask me, that's one of the biggest challenges we have as a country, because from one political dispensation to the next, we don't seem to have a common thread in terms of what's happening, right? So the First Republic left us at a certain point. Then we had the Second Republic, we had liberalization, and that liberalization was over-liberalization, because we had manufacturing that died. We're now trying to get back to manufacturing now. You then had, if you think about the time of the late Levi Patrick Manasseh, he started things like winter maize, which basically was trying to build resilient agriculture. After he left, what happened to that project, right? Then we had the period of infrastructure development under the Patriotic Front. Then we now have the UPND government. Infrastructure went away. We probably should have been looking at how do we optimize some of this infrastructure now that we have it. Now we're talking about, let's do local value addition, let's grow exports, let's diversify our mining sector. So let's grow the mining sector but diversify it still in terms of minerals. So part of the reason why in my thinking we haven't been able to diversify is that in each dispensation we've sort of had what is dominant rather than had a common thread through all of them, so that we have one building on the other. But if you then look at the 8th National Development Plan, this last 4-year period, it is very consistent in terms of what it's trying to drive. Even things like, for example, investment in health, education. You pointed out earlier that the number is not significant, but if you compare it to where it was, say, 5 years ago, it's coming from 9% of the budget. It's now between 11. I think health education is even around 15% of the budget. So you can see the budget budget has been reconfigured into those priority areas. And if we rally around the 8th National Development Plan and continue to apply it irrespective of...
Education has actually done much better. You're talking of over 14% now.
Yeah, but if you look at where that's coming from, it's just these last 4 budgets. I think it was less than 10% only 4 or 5 years ago.
The elephant in the room, obviously, is the energy sector. And I'd just like to quickly quote, generating around 1,091 megawatts out of a possible 3,600 megawatts installed capacity. To mitigate this deficit, the minister said government was to import power from Mozambique, Namibia and South Africa, ZESCO and other independent power producers. Also investment into alternative energy technologies, while government promotes off-grid solutions like solar and generators. Additionally, the support, we know that through ZCCMIH, Mamba has initiated the construction of another extra 300 megawatts, capacity, so from 300 to 600. So that's long term. Now, ZESCO is not in a very good position financial-wise. We still owe on the importation front from the previous agreements. There's protracted debate on why we should still be selling or exporting while we are in this deficit. For many Zambians, actually, that I spoke to, both the president's speech and this budget, many Zambians really wanted to hear something very significant, something very bold and loud about bringing an end to this energy crisis. Did the minister speak to that, really?
And for me, I think, like I said, it's probably about context. So you can see, I mean, the minister's speech highlights a number of specific projects. Obviously, those are not entirely within his control, sometimes not even in the control of ZESCO. 100 megawatts here, 100 megawatts there, 100 megawatts there, and things like that. Hopefully, they all add up. I think what the budget speech itself didn't really do is acknowledge what had been done earlier in the year, right? So in the supplementary budget, there was a specific amount allocated to clear amounts owed to suppliers in other countries so that we could trigger additional supplies, which from what I seem to understand has happened. But in the budget, there's no recap of that. So you sort of have to read this budget together with the supplementary budget. A lot of the activities in terms are probably long-term, right? You can't do large-scale projects. Even the Mamba, which is 300 megawatts, it's not going to be done in a month or 2 or 3, right? It's going to take a bit of time. And I think that's where taking a keen interest in Zambia's integrated energy plan, the integrated resource plan, is quite critical, because it factors in everything that we need to know, right? We need to expand, we're trying to expand mining production. Where is that power going to come from? Because power is so critical, you don't sort it out, you've got huge problems throughout the economy. So this particular budget, I think it does what it can, constrained in that regard. I think it also acknowledges that a lot of those solutions are not short-term. But remember also, when you add other policy pronouncements, things like open access, it means it's not just ZESCO are looking to fix this problem. If you are an independent power producer and you can produce and you can sell into the grid, it's become easier. If you are producing or generating power below a certain level, I think it's 5 megawatts, it's become easier. If you want to put even things like net metering, though I understand for it to work fully, you need power anyway, it's also been made available. So it's a whole host long-term things like connecting to the East African power pool and Tanzania in order to tap into that. Those are long-term things. So you've got long-term, short-term, immediate. The issue is that a lot of these problems don't have absolute immediate solutions.
If the country in a day is being load shed for between 17 to 21 hours, that is over 80% of productivity taken out. I know there's discussions with sectors, the Association of Manufacturers and ZESCO, in what is critical installations and how factories and industries should be given power, inclusive of the mines that have also resorted to their own agreements with importation. But by and large, we can agree that the economy is not operating at optimum. It's probably operating at almost 30 to 40%, which means reduced productivity.
Absolutely.
How then, when there's reduced productivity, do we project an increment from 2.3% to 6%? 0.8% on GDP. How can we then project that we expect to reduce inflation from 15% to 6% when productivity is at its lowest?
That's the question. And if you remember my initial statement, I said ambitious. That falls into the ambitious category, because when you think about it, this year Zambia is supposed to grow 2.3%, right? Let's assume that at the end of this year we have normal or above normal rainfall. Okay, let's assume we pull back some generating capacity. Let's look at sectors like agriculture, right? If in the last farming season you planted and you went all out and you're expecting to get a significant harvest and you lost all of that, likely you have lost a significant proportion of your capital. So even if you get no more rainfall, the question is, how do you start to pick up from there, right? If you fly over Zambia, you see commercial farmers, a lot of them haven't planted their pivots in full because of not just rain, but the power situation. So even if things go back to normal next year, there is still a bit in terms of the bottom. Where is the bottom before you start building up? So that's why I say ambitious. But there's still some potential upside. Like, for example, the mining sector, having made their own arrangements from a power perspective. I was in the northwestern province just last week. You can see it's all guns blazing, full speed ahead in a lot of those sectors. The challenge is that they'll be producing, but because of the higher cost of power, higher cost of running generators, they'll probably be less profitable. But you can see that they are there. You can see other sectors that have come to the party, like ICT, which is also holding fort in terms of what's there. But it's a difficult state of affairs, and that's why my initial statement was it appears ambitious. So growth can be there, but whether it gets to 6.6%, I'm not sure.
You spoke of a balancing act, and again, you're an economic technocrat or expert, I would like to put it. So let me not corner you to a political side. Yeah. But one would rather argue that some of the things we see happening here speak to political popularity. I mean, it's not rocket science that this budget speaks a year before an election. You've touched on agriculture. Climate change teaches us, again, with the patterns that we've seen. Most parts of central and southern province were largely our agricultural hub in terms of producing maize and livestock. I mean, the Chisamba block and southern province. More rains and floods seem to be happening in the northern part. We don't of the country. We don't do very well with maize farming there and so on. Are we seeing any resource application that if we have more rains there? I mean, I'm looking at the agricultural budget here, 15.4 million across fisheries, livestock and agriculture in itself. We're again back to problematic issues. Farmer Input Support Program, 9.2 billion. The minister told me last time in an interview, good initiative, but misapplied. We always make a loss because our farmers don't graduate. Are we not throwing money into water?
Good money after bad.
Strategic food reserves, 2.3 million. I agree we need strategic food reserves, but others will argue we had stock and we sold. So,
I mean, those are probably those are complex and many questions. But if you take a step back, and I said it right at the beginning, what appears to be the priority, right? So you can ask the question: is this influenced by an upcoming election? I mean, it's an honest question. You can ask.
One key issue touched on: road infrastructure. It's gone up from 8. It's now 11.9. Let's just say 12 billion.
12 billion. Yeah.
Is this a priority right now?
So here's so from what I understand.
Or what is the rationale?
Okay, so here's the rationale.
What will the 12 billion stimulate?
So here's the catch. You've got, and if you look at, like I said, these budgets, they make a lot of sense when you read them together, right? That there is, let's deal with the roads. There is an intention to open up areas for tourism. There's an intention to open up areas for agriculture, all right? The large-scale farming blocks, etc. The initial hypothesis of this government is that infrastructure would be built through what? PPP, right? PPP needs commercially viable business case in order to take off. not all infrastructure investment is able to generate a commercially viable business case from day one. If you're going to say you need to build roads around Nansanga farming block, right, which private-public partnership is going to do that? So starting in 2024 budget, that's when we started to see a significant uptick in infrastructure, because the government acknowledged that, look, infrastructure that is necessary for investment and long-term growth may not always be a candidate for PPP. So the government needs to do its part. If you saw last year's budget, there was a specific amount for government, for ZNS, for under the CDF, and under the local Ministry of Local Government as actors, in addition to PPP, as 5 different actors through which infrastructure, specifically road infrastructure, would be constructed. And that this year is basically just a continuation of that. So if you are going to, we're talking about resilience and diversifying the economy. If we're going to build large-scale farming blocks, who's going to go and farm in the middle of nowhere if there's no road infrastructure? So I think that's the logic and rationale there. The rest of it, in terms of how is the budget calibrated and where are the priorities, we can sort of pick and choose in terms of some of these. But there are also some things which are quite clear. Over the years, the amount of investment going into health and education has increased significantly. If you look at infrastructure, you look at the amounts that are being spent on the agricultural projects, they are there. They acknowledge that, for example, input support program is not efficient, move everybody onto e-voucher, etc. I mean, those are things we've been hearing about for a number of years. Maybe you need to have a conversation with the Minister of Agriculture for more information.
Again, 16.1 billion of this is going towards social protection. I did ask you earlier on that it seems this budget is more consumption and dependent on a very few in the formal sector to finance this. This year has seen the central bank make adjustment upwards. The monetary policy rate and others, you're talking around 26%, the other at 15%. Spiraling into, again, let me not say an increment, but the cost of borrowing and lending is too high. You said earlier, averaging 28%.
Yeah.
So again, there's no incentive on the side for businesses to grow. The current setup of things for you to just register a business, but the kind of documentation you need, you're required to have a NAPSA certificate, a ZRS certificate that are now interlinked into the EGP. You don't have any of these documents. You cannot tender.
I hear you.
It takes you 3,000 kwacha to buy a tender document. I need to come to professionals like yourselves to give me audit reports, management and litigation status. Sure. So who will participate in this economy?
So two things you've mentioned there, Costa. Let's deal with the first one, which is bottlenecks, right? And for me, it's very clear, and I've engaged the Honorable Minister of Finance. In a time of crisis such as this, we should have as few bottlenecks as possible. We can't, if we're having to deal with these administrative issues, it's tantamount to a country fighting a war externally with all these factors we have, and also having a civil war internally. That's a recipe for disaster. So anything that can be done to make life easier for businesses and individuals should be prioritized. How effective, for example, is the civil service? How quick are the turnarounds? How many licenses do you need? Let's clean that up so that you don't have the headache of finding capital, as well as how quickly is your form being reviewed. Then on the issue of cost of doing business from a borrowing perspective, you're very right, it's elevated. For you to 28%, if you're going to make a return, what sort of a business are you doing? But there are a few things in here. If you look at the discipline government is trying to drive from a borrowing perspective, that's meant to bring down that reliance, and it's there. If you look at how much government has been borrowing, in fact, in this budget, you can actually see things like domestic borrowing in terms of government securities has come down, but it's more attributed to the availability of liquidity rather than government's direct intent. If you look at the uplift in things like the credit guarantee scheme from just over 350 million kwacha to 851, it's not a big number, but it's meant to reduce the cost of borrowing for a borrower who can get the guarantee. But here's the real issue, and it's something that we need to address as a business, as a country, sorry. The real problem with the cost of financing is not that interest rates from commercial banks are too high. It's that we have a lack of diversity in sources of capital. Now let me explain. Not every business is a candidate for a commercial bank, because a commercial bank is tied to depositors. Maybe the maximum deposit they have is 3 years. They can't lend you longer than 3 years. Costa, how long has it taken you to build Diamond TV? If you went to a commercial bank on day one, you would have still been building Diamond TV by the time you started to pay off. You needed a development bank. Where is our development bank? It's non-existent. We need a functioning development bank that takes on higher risk projects longer term. What's happening with our venture capital environment? Nothing. What's happening with our Lusaka Stock Exchange? When was the last time there was a listing? Because some of the entities that are looking for capital should be candidates for a listing, but they're not listing. Why? Why does everybody want to get money from a bank at 28%? Not everybody is a candidate for a commercial bank. And that's the bit that we have to get right. And obviously some of it is government to drive, but a lot of it is also the private sector in terms of setting up alternative capital vehicles that can then help to provide fairly priced capital, right tenure, and with the appropriate risk appetite. That's where the issue is. But from the commercial bank's point of view, it's going to be a while before that comes down.
But back to the issue of bottlenecks, really, because people argue, and I've heard this so much, this statement, it's not government's role to create employment or provide jobs. Theirs is to provide a conducive or enabling environment for the private sector then to create jobs.
Correct.
But with these bottlenecks that I spoke about, I mean, to get a tax certificate now, it's being issued to you every quarter. That's prohibitive, really. A NAPSA certificate is equally the same. You're tied to penalties and garnishes and so on. Can't we do much more for the private sector?
And that's exactly my point. I totally agree with you that in this environment, everything possible must be done to make business as easy as it can be. Now that's as a standard, right? But even more so in a crisis, right? Because we can't be battling to stay alive and survive with fundamental issues like financing, like the cost of running your generators, like the cost of keeping your employees employed and happy and surviving. At the same time, your project is delayed because the inspection or a document hasn't been approved or concluded on a timely basis, thereby holding back whatever project you may need to do. So whatever happens, bottlenecks need to be eliminated to the greatest extent possible. We often hear that a lot of the challenges we have has to do with the efficiency of the civil service, and the appeal is everyone in the civil service, please, we need your help now more than ever before, because we've got so many other issues that we're dealing with as a private sector. So anything that you can do to make our lives easier, we really appreciate.
From an economist point of view, really, sorry, I'll ask you this question. It could be the same, but in a different way.
No problem.
Where should we be focusing our efforts and energies? Is it on public services, social protection, or really economic affairs, so that then we get a return on investment? If 34% and 7.5% is going towards public service and social protection, only 22% is what is financing the economy. Then there should be something totally wrong, in my opinion. You talk about crisis and response. The current crisis is an environmental crisis. But you're allocating below 1% to the environment.
1.4 billion.
5% to defense, 4% to public order and safety. We're not in a war. Housing, 1.4%. Are we prioritizing correctly?
Yeah. So I think you've got some very valid comments and questions that need to come through there. I think from a priority perspective, I agree with you. Something like environmental, in this environment, surely we should be seeing a lot more coming through there. So it obviously goes without saying. You asked me a question about priorities. What would I be thinking about, right? So let's start from the understanding that resources are constrained, right? And resources are constrained and we're in a crisis. what do we do? Okay, so we can argue: do we try and save the people who are most vulnerable, or do we try and support businesses so that in essence they contribute more and eventually support those who are more vulnerable? Who knows, we may not find all of them. So let me say I sympathize with the Honorable Minister on that one, because people need to eat, they need to survive. If they do, then perhaps we have a fighting chance, okay? But then let's then broaden it out and say, all right, so where do we start? Do we go to small businesses or do we go to large businesses first, right? And in the environment that we're in, I think that the most efficient way is to actually look at large businesses first, right? Why? And let's extrapolate. With the recovery of Luansha mine, for example, in Luansha, how many other businesses has it potentially pulled along with it, right? Think of it in that way. If you go to Kansanshi and you see what S3 means, when say S3 project and $1.3 billion is being invested there, $1.2 billion, I've seen it. What does it mean? You have countless contractors on site who are also employing others, right? If you go to Lumwana and say they are building a super pit, $2 billion, that investment has been encouraged. What does it mean? When you say Mopani is coming alive, KCM, what do those mean, right? From an efficiency point of view, it's probably the place to start, all right? So without doubt, because you pull along others as well. The other thing that I think is an opportunity, which I'm not too sure is very clear here, is how do you turn a crisis into an opportunity, right? So where exactly do we see that if there's a crisis here, where's the opportunity? You have been clear about things like the Environmental Protection Fund. If there was ever a year where the number should increase dramatically, it's not a big number to start with. So even if you doubled it, it's not like you're taking a huge amount out of the budget. So that's something, for example, you say, look, we need to reform environmental protection. We are in the middle of a climate-induced crisis. How much are we putting to climate, to the environment, etc.? That's something. Even just the way the budget is presented to say we need to become a climate-resilient economy. We talk about the green economy. Did you get a sense that this is a green economy supporting budget? That's probably something that we can probably emphasize. Then simple things as well, like we have a weak currency supports export. In theory, right? It supports two things: export and import substitution. Can we have a fund or a process or extra support for large exporters, because their products, if they meet international standards, are now more competitive in other jurisdictions, and therefore we can stimulate more economic activity by putting a bit more there. So if you think about what I've said, big business as a catalyst, and those that are creating linkages into the economy, pulling SMEs along. And some of these things, when you do them, you can have terms and conditions that apply. Say, we want to see the following in terms of outputs or measures or your contribution. You then have the environment and climate as an immediate crisis, and how do we integrate that better? When we're doing our construction, for example, construction is going up to 11, is that climate resilient infrastructure, right? So that you mainstream the discussion around the green economy. And then the other bit I've talked about is things like exports. For example,
one of the other bigger chunk of money here that the New Dawn administration says, according to them, it's there in the minister's speech, game changer, and the decentralization is the CDF. It's increased from 4.8 to 5.6 billion this year, from about 31 now to 36 million per annum per constituency. Should all of us now be formulating cooperatives and really looking at working at a constituency level? Is this a priority area, really, CDF?
I think so. It is. I'm not sure whether it needed to be increased as aggressively as it has been.
Yes, because it has. From its first inception, moved from 1.5
to 25.
To 20.
And the only reason why I say whether it needed to increase as aggressively as it has is because of the challenges we've had around absorption, right? So if all of it that was being pumped there was also being absorbed fairly rapidly, I mean, the speech is a bit silent about the absorption rate, so that's something we need to figure out. But assuming it's not being absorbed at the rate that is being granted. Perhaps there's some opportunity to scale it back slightly and move elsewhere, but we also know it's not meant to expire, so that those resources are there and will be plowed into those particular communities. So that, I think, is a priority, because it's obviously, and it's a bit of a mixed bag from what we see, right, in terms of some constituencies that have really embraced it and are really driving it, others who are not. I'm looking forward to the latest. I think the Auditor General does some work around this, telling us about how well absorption has been. So that, I think, is a priority, and is also a direct stimulus in the economy. So you asked, should we be taking an interest? The answer, Costa, is why not? We are all citizens.
Let's finally end on one interesting aspect you've pointed out. After all is said and done, yes, there's a budget, planning for expenditure and how we'll gain the income. At the end of every financial year, you, the auditors, will come in. What is bad that, yes, even if we have an ambitious yet constrained budget, the leakages in the Auditor General's report are very damning and disheartening. In a stressed economy, these figures of misapplication,
misappropriation,
and even the non-execution of projects. We may boast that 5+ million on CDF, but what will actually be used will be less than that. Where do we go wrong?
Like you said, I think you've been clear. So execution, I think perhaps not everyone is pulling in the same direction. I think the issues around corruption and some of the issues that get highlighted in the Auditor General's report, obviously not great, especially under the circumstances. And something that we need to point out, right? In the budget, you've got an increasing number that's coming from grants and donors. I think it's about 8 billion. I think it's up 138%. That number is very sensitive to issues around fraud and corruption. If donors start hearing that there's misapplication, misappropriation,
roughly 3.8%.
Yeah, but if you look at the number, it's
about project grants 4.1 million, program grants 4 million.
Yeah, so if you add the two,
4 billion actually.
Yeah, so if you add the two, that's the 8 billion, and it's up 138% over the previous year. So the issue is, that's a significant portion of your funding. That number is very sensitive to what's up, the noises coming out of the Auditor General's report. Because remember, when donors are giving you money, they're taking money from their citizens to give to our citizens, and then when they hear that their hard-earned taxpayer money, some of those countries are having their own struggles, right, in terms of the rate at which the economies are growing. When they hear that some of what has been sacrificed on their part for Zambian citizens is then ending up in individuals' pockets, it's a recipe for disaster. That is, there's already constraint and looking for reasons to scale back. You are simply confirming that they should indeed scale back. So it's absolutely fundamental that issues of corruption, issues of misapplication, issues that are highlighted in the Auditor General's report are dealt with, and dealt with decisively, because if not, it's not just we are losing the opportunities here, we're actually potentially starting to encourage or discourage our donors from continuing to support us, as well as just wasting resources for the benefit of a few. So that is very critical, and hopefully it continues to receive a good amount of support and action.
Andrew Chiwa, thank you so much for talking to me this evening.
Thank you very much.
That wraps up this week's edition. We were looking at the 2025 budget analysis. My guest was the country's senior partner, PwC Zambia, Mr. Andrew Chiwa. Remember, we are live on Diamond TV Zambia Facebook page, as well as Costa Monster, that's my page, and of course on YouTube. Thank you so much. Good night.
Costa was brought to you by FQM Trident Limited, a subsidiary of First Quantum Minerals Limited.